in a cold, remote province of the Swedish Empire called Finland. A rebellion was brewing in the 16th century. A leader emerged who went full peasant rage mode on a European superpower. And somehow, you've probably never heard of Jaakko Ilkka. And the men that followed him, they weren't really soldiers. History would remember them as the Clubmen. In 1596, Finland was part of the Kingdom of Sweden. The kingdom itself was deeply divided. King Sigismund, ruling from faraway Poland, was Catholic, while much of Sweden's powerful nobility, led by Duke Charles, was fiercely Lutheran. This power struggle spilled into Finland, where Klaus Fleming, loyal to Sigismund, ruled with an iron hand. For 25 years leading up to the Club War, Sweden, and by extension Finland, had been locked in a brutal war with Russia. This long conflict drained resources, deepened poverty, and justified the hated military quartering system, where Finnish peasants were forced to house and feed royal soldiers. Even worse, the nobles continued to collect taxes, growing rich on the backs of the starving. And towering over all stood Klaus Fleming, the king's iron-fisted viceroy in Finland. Abuses ran rampant. The rage of the farmers needed only a spark. In the mid to late 1500s, there was no Finland as a nation. It was a remote eastern province of the Kingdom of Sweden. There were only scattered parishes, trading towns, and isolated farms, loosely tied together under Swedish rule. The people spoke Finnish dialects, but the language of rulers, laws, and the military was Swedish. Life in 16th century Finland was harsh. Winters were merciless. Nature set the rhythm of life. Harvests often failed. Disease and famine were constant companions. Politically, Finland was neglected. It was a military frontier against Russia. To the Swedish crown, Finland was a resource. Christianity had taken hold, but old folk beliefs and traditions still lived in the countryside. Most rural people were illiterate. Local identity was strong. Jaakko Ilkka's story did not begin in rebellion. It began in the fields of Ilmajoki. To understand the Clubmen and Jaakko Ilkka, we must first understand the area they came from. South Ostrobothnia, a place with its own distinct soul. The people of South Ostrobothnia have long carried a reputation in Finland. Even today, they're seen as proud, stubborn, and fiercely independent. And that hasn't changed much in 500 years. Their sense of local pride runs deep. As the saying goes in Finland, an Ostrobothnian doesn't bow, even if he falls. Jaakko Ilkka was born in the 1550s into a family of influence. His father served as a lay judge and the master of the great Ranasto estate. When the family moved to a new farm, it became known as Ilkala. Ilkala was the second largest estate in all of Ilmajoki, rivaled only by the powerful Peltoniemi family, a rivalry that would cast a long shadow over Jaakko's life. In 1585, Jaakko Ilkka became the master of Ilkala, and just a year later, he rose to the position of nimismies, sheriff of Ilmajoki. For 2 years, Jaakko presided over local justice, until the Peltoniemi family reclaimed the office. The seeds of bitter hostility were sown when Ilkka was forced to prosecute Tuomas Matinpoika Peltoniemi for various crimes in court. Old wounds would fester, and one day they would cost him dearly. At a time when most Finnish peasants were crushed by poverty, Ilkka grew wealthy through trade. He transported cargo for the crown across the vastness of the Swedish Empire. Ilmajoki may have been far from the sea, but Ilkka perhaps even owned his own ship on the Swedish-speaking coast. He was, by the standards of his time, a rich man, owning 4 horses, 30 cattle, and 32 sheep. It's likely he spoke not only Finnish, but also Swedish. When war between Sweden and Russia raged in the east, Ilkka again saw opportunity. He armed and supplied 2 mounted soldiers, one of them himself, for the king's army. For this, he was granted valuable privileges, tax exemptions for his lands, the right to collect fees from other farmers. By 1592, Ilkka had marched under the banner of Field Marshal Klaus Fleming himself, taking part in brutal raids deep into Russian territory. But fate is strange. Just a few years later, Ilkka would take up arms against that same man. Ilkka was not just a farmer or a merchant anymore. He was a man of the sword, a mounted soldier of minor nobility. Yet even as his wealth and influence grew, the world around Ilkka darkened. Finland's farmers starved under the burden of endless taxes and the forced hosting of troops. Discontent simmered in the villages. The wealthy merchant, the sheriff, the soldier, would soon become a rebel. Every story of rebellion needs its tyrant, and in Finland's darkest winter, there was no name more feared than Klaus Fleming. Born into power, raised among the highest nobility, Klaus Fleming was not a man of compromise. He ruled Finland not as a governor, but as a military dictator. A man whose loyalty to the Swedish king was absolute and whose cruelty became legend. Klaus Fleming rose to power through sheer stubbornness, ruthlessness, and a relentless will. He was known for his coarse manners, harsh words, and open contempt for the polished courtly culture of the nobility. Among the common people, and even his peers, Fleming earned a long list of mocking nicknames. Yet among his soldiers, he was beloved, a rare commander who genuinely cared for the welfare of his men. His reputation for cruelty, however, was legendary. One grim story tells of a young man who dared to threaten Fleming with reporting his abuses to Duke Charles. Fleming had the boy's tongue cut out. To the farmers of South Ostrobothnia, he was the face of their suffering. Against such a man, The uprising of Jaakko Ilkka would not be a battle of equals. It would be a stand against overwhelming power. The club war did not erupt overnight. It grew from years of quiet anger. Already by the late 1570s, brave men led delegations all the way to Stockholm, begging the king to end the suffering. Their pleas were ignored. Foreign mercenaries, even Scottish soldiers, marched into Ostrobothnia. By 1593, unrest at home boiled over. Local uprisings flared under the leadership of men like Pentiputu and Pentipiri, easily crushed by Fleming's iron hand. Still, hope flickered. The farmers cast their eyes toward Duke Charles, who promised to abolish military quartering forever. But in distant Turku, Klaus Fleming refused. Rebellion was no longer a question of if, it was only a question of when. And who would lead? In the winter of 1596, ruthless oppression had driven the farmers of South Ostrobothnia to the edge of despair. Their eyes turned to Jaakko Ilkka. Ilkka did not seek the role. He was a landowner, a former local sheriff, a man with much to lose. But among the farmers, he was respected. No one knows for certain why Jaakko Ilkka chose rebellion. As a minor noble, he benefited from the very system the farmers despised. The military quartering system gave him power and profit. And yet, he chose war. Some said it was ambition, that Ilkka wanted to be more than a merchant, more than a landowner, that he dreamed of leading Ostrobothnia. Others whispered of secret promises, rewards from the farmers, alliances against rivals like the Peltoniemi family. Or maybe it was something more. Maybe Ilkka saw a people broken under injustice and could not look away. Some historians believe Ilkka's choice was not driven by greed, but by principle. For by siding with the peasants, Ilkka risked everything. His fortune, his lands, his life. It's also been argued that Jaakko Ilkka only joined the uprising to avoid becoming a target of the peasant army himself. The truth is, Ilkka's real motives may never be fully known. As tensions grew, Finland stood at a crossroads. From his stronghold, Duke Charles sent letters across the sea, promises of freedom from the hated military quartering. Meanwhile, Klaus Fleming ignored Charles's orders, banned all appeals to Sweden, and closed Finland's ports with a naval blockade. Fear spread, but so did anger. As the split between King Sigismund and Duke Charles deepened, Fleming tightened his grip, turning his rule into a reign of terror. In 1595, Charles's allies gathered at Söderköping and named him regent, a governor of Sweden. But in Finland, the nobility stayed loyal to Sigismund and Fleming. Cut off from the nobility, Duke Charles turned to the only power left, the peasants. And soon they would answer his call, with clubs in their hands. By 1593, unrest was already bubbling. In South Ostrobothnia, the first armed clashes erupted, a warning of the storm to come. In the winter of 1595, Jaakko Ilkka sought advice from Hannu Fordell. Fordell was a sheriff and one of the representatives of the peasants in Stockholm. Ilkka asked a simple question to Hannu. May we take back the grain the soldiers have stolen from us? Fordell answered, Duke Charles grants you the right to take back what was stolen. True or not, it was enough. The seed of open rebellion had been planted. At the dawn of 1596, the long smouldering anger finally burst into action. Ilkka led the first strike. Peasants stormed the granaries, seizing back the grain stolen under the hated military quartering taxes. Within days, they drove the crown soldiers out of the region. Meanwhile, on Christmas night of 1595, far to the east in Rautalampi, another fire was lit. A brutal uprising erupted, and several crown soldiers paid with their lives. Fleming's retaliation was swift and brutal. Ilkka was captured and dragged south in chains to Turku Castle. After the defeat of Ilkka's first uprising, a group of weary Finnish peasants stood before Duke Charles in Stockholm. They begged for soldiers to defend them, or at least permission to rise up against Fleming's men. Charles refused to send troops, but before they left, he gave them a final piece of advice. I cannot give you anything else but this counsel. Make peace with your own hands. Are you not so many that you could shake off the soldiers? If not with weapons, then with fence posts and clubs. Defend yourselves on land. I will guard the sea. The words of Duke Charles spread quickly. To the desperate farmers, his message sounded like a green light for rebellion. In truth, Charles had been careful. He had only hinted at self-defense, not open war. The words of Duke Charles have often been called the spark that ignited the club war. Yet their true meaning remains unclear. Charles never expected the peasants to defeat Klaus Fleming. He merely hoped to spark small troubles in Finland, just enough to weaken his enemy. But the spark he lit would turn into a wildfire. Far away in the dungeons of Turku Castle, Jaakko Ilkka sat imprisoned. The infamous Turku dungeons would have crushed lesser men. Against all odds, Ilkka escaped from the dungeons of Turku. Some say he climbed the walls with a rope woven from his own torn clothes. Others claim he was aided, perhaps by his wife's relatives in Turku, perhaps by secret allies loyal to Duke Charles. One rumor even whispered he crawled through the castle's waste drains, wriggling through the filth to freedom. None can say for sure. But one night, Jaakko Ilkka disappeared from the fortress. No man escaped. By November 1596, the fires of rebellion had flared again, greater, fiercer than before, and the people needed a leader. Ilkka returned to home, not as a landowner, not as a tradesman, but as a symbol, a man who had escaped the unescapable. In late 1596, Jaakko Ilkka stood at the head of a peasant army. A wealthy man had become a rebel. On November 25th, 1596, a restless group of peasants, whipped into anger by the fiery Pentipiri, attacked a detachment of infantry soldiers at Kirri Church. According to the story, Piri, reportedly drunk at the time, remarked about the cavalrymen. Wouldn't matter if their guts were ripped out. After their victory, the peasants began to celebrate. Nearby, in the house of Irjo Konsas, local leaders gathered and made a decision. The payment of forced quartering tax would end, effective immediately. It is likely that the real instigators were the peasant delegates who had only just returned from Sweden. They knew that Fleming's wrath would soon fall upon them, whether they rebelled or not. Authorities acted swiftly. That very evening, men loyal to Fleming stormed Konsas's house and arrested the peasant leaders. They were dragged off to a nearby manor and held captive under grim conditions. During the night, a band of determined peasants struck back. They stormed the manor, freed their comrades, and in the chaos killed one of the king's soldiers with an axe, the first casualty of the coming war. From there, the revolt spread like fire through dry grass. The peasants did not stop at refusing taxes. Fueled by fury, they began raiding and burning the estates of noblemen, landowners, and government officials associated with Klaus Fleming's hated regime. Led again by Pentti Piri, the looting began in Lapua. Fleming's newly appointed sheriff for the region fled south in panic, his own estate spared only by chance or calculation. At first, the rebellion's goal seemed modest: to purge South Ostrobothnia of Fleming soldiers and officials and reclaim their rights. There was no initial plan to march beyond the natural southern border of their homeland. Ilkka, who had just escaped from the dungeons of Turku Castle, now returned to the stage as the chosen commander of the uprising. Under Ilkka's leadership, every able-bodied man in Kuru, Lapua, and Ilmajoki was ordered to take up arms. Ilkka's peasant army soon numbered at least 1,500 men, possibly more than 2,000, though among them were also the weak, the old, and some who'd been forced into the rebellion against their will. A rare eyewitness account from the time has survived. A Swedish official named Sven Jonimpoika wrote this shocked report back to Sweden. And now, every man from 3 parishes, about 3,000 in total, has set off with their clubs, marching through the Hemi forests towards Savo. They aim to sweep across the land, murdering, looting, and burning wherever anyone has profited from the peasantry. Their leader is named Jaakko Ilkka, the same man Klaus Fleming held prisoner last summer. He had made a rope from his clothes and escaped over the wall. Once this border inspection is complete, I intend to leave this land of robbers. Klaus Fleming and his supporters immediately blamed Duke Charles for the uprising, convinced that it was part of a broader conspiracy to unseat King Sigismund's rule in Finland. The storm had broken, and there was no turning back. In early December 1596, a delegation arrived at the Karo rebel camp, begging the men to help liberate Upper Satakunta from the hated army lodgings. A momentous decision was made. The uprising would no longer be a local protest. It would become a full-scale march against Klaus Fleming. The plan was ambitious. The rebel army would split into 3 groups. Ilkka and Irjo Konsas commanded the main force moving toward Pirkala. Pentti Puutu led a western column along the coast. Martti Tuomala and Pentti Piri were dispatched eastward. The final destination was Turku, the heart of Fleming's power. Originally, the commander of the western column was to be Martti Tuomala, the sheriff of Lapua. However, Pentti Puutu felt sidelined and demanded to lead the expedition. He argued that he had opposed the military quartering longer than Tuomala. As they moved, the rebels vowed to destroy noble manors and cavalry estates, seeking revenge for years of suffering. Royal estates and known allies of Duke Charles were to be spared. Their arsenal was humble but dangerous. The clubmen's hands gripped spears, swords, battle axes, pikes, halberds, crossbows, hacked muskets, and even old hunting firearms used for bringing down bears. But their most fearsome weapon was something else entirely: the chain mace, a brutal iron tool capable of smashing through plate armor. Against foot soldiers, the peasants were dangerously well armed, but against Fleming's army, with its cavalry and artillery, they were outmatched. At first, many believed they could force Fleming's hand without open battle. Others, more realistic, knew they were marching into a war that would pit simple peasants against the professional armies of Sweden. No lords were coming to save them. No foreign powers would intervene. They would have to fight or die alone. As Ilkka's army crossed into Jalasjärvi, tensions exploded. Some men refused to march beyond Ostrobothnia's borders. Ilkka made a brutal choice. To restore discipline, he ordered the drowning of Mauno Matinpoika Peltoniemi, an old rival and ringleader of the dissenters. Peltoniemi was drowned through a hole in the ice, a method chosen to avoid bloodshed, following deep-rooted superstitions. This brutal act sent a clear message: there would be no room for weakness or rebellion within their own ranks. Still, Ilkka tried to balance fear with mercy. On December 19, he and Yrjö Kontsas freed the lame and sick, granting them written pardons to return home. The army pressed southward. They looted manors, petty noblemen's farms, and anything tied to Fleming's rule. One unfortunate sheriff's assistant was drowned in Ruoviisi. By December 17, Klaus Fleming was already mustering his professional troops. On the coast, Pentti Puutu's group tried a daring move. In Lappeenranta, they captured a small detachment of foot soldiers and offered their sergeant leadership. He pretended to accept, then slipped away at the first chance. When Puutu's men reached Ulvila around December 20th, they demanded the loyalty of Akseli Kurki, one of Fleming's best commanders. Kurki refused. Instead, he crushed the rebels with 300 mounted soldiers in a swift, ruthless clash, now known as the Battle of Ulvila. Puutu was captured alive and hauled off to the dungeons of Turku Castle. He later died in the dungeon, reportedly driven to death by a vermin. After the battle, Akseli Kurki rode hard to rejoin Fleming's main force. The hunt for Jaakko Ilkka was on. Ilkka's forces achieved a small but important success on December 22nd, when they drove an 80-man infantry out of Heminkirö. Just days later, on December 27, his clubmen repelled another enemy detachment, a minor clash that cost the enemy one man. The victories gave hope, but ahead loomed the bloodiest clash of the rebellion. By December 22nd, Ilkka's army reached Nokia Manor. The small eastern detachment of rebels led by Tuomala and Piri, which had deliberately sparked the uprising in northern Hemi, joined Ilkka's main army on December 24. The manor was fortified by the royal forces, but it was isolated, vulnerable before Fleming's main army could arrive. Ilkka seized the manor and set up a defensive camp. It was a bold move, and a dangerous one. Ilkka knew Klaus Fleming would come, but perhaps he could force a negotiation. Even secure a lasting victory for the peasants. His men dug into the snow, built defenses, and prepared for the battle that would decide everything. For a moment, it seemed as if the impossible might be within reach. But from the south, across the snowy horizon, the sound of drums and hoofbeats grew louder. Fleming was coming, and he was bringing the full fury of the crown with him. By the final night of 1596, the battlefield was set. Klaus Fleming's professional army, 3,300 men strong, with 1,200 armoured cavalry, surrounded the rebel camp at Nokia. Jaakko Ilkka's exhausted force numbered perhaps 2,500. Fleming struck with cunning, not raw force. He unleashed a thundering barrage of cannon fire onto the camp, rattling the rebels' resolve. Next, Fleming then sent a negotiator and an interpreter to deliver a message to the rebels. He would agree to their demand to end the forced quartering of troops and would allow them to leave freely if the rebel leaders were handed over for punishment. Some sources claim the first attempt at negotiation actually came from the peasants. Regardless, Fleming's promise seems to have been a deceitful ploy meant to trick the opposition into surrendering. His sub-commanders would later use similarly false promises in other battles of the Club War. As the cold of New Year's night deepened, the rebel camp began to unravel. Men argued. Some wanted to accept the terms. Others shouted betrayal. Someone set fire to a nearby barn, and the flames lit up the countryside, exposing the chaos. In the midst of the turmoil, fearing he would be handed over, Jaakko Ilkka mounted a horse and fled into the black winter night, alone. With their leader gone, the clubmen broke into panic. Hundreds poured onto the frozen roads, hoping to outrun their fate. But Fleming's cavalry was already moving. All night, the professional soldiers rode down the fleeing farmers, cutting them down without mercy along the snowy road north. The ground was littered with the dead, at least 500 lives lost before dawn. The first phase of the Club War had ended in blood, defeat, and despair. Jaakko Ilkka fled into the forests of South Osterbothnia. Word of the rebellion's collapse spread fast. Opposition moved quickly. Determined to win favor with Fleming, local rivals captured the defeated leaders as they returned home. According to tradition, Ilkka was seized in Ilmajoki, perhaps betrayed by the family of Mauno Peltoniemi, the rival he had earlier executed by drowning. They delivered him into the hands of Fleming's men. Klaus Fleming sent a letter ordering that the captured rebel leaders be brought to him for questioning, but his letter arrived too late. Fearing new uprisings, local bailiff ordered the execution of Ilkka, Piri, Konsas, and the others without delay. There, in the silence of winter, justice was done. The kind of justice that rulers inflict on those who dare rise against them. In an act of ultimate cruelty, the bailiff forced one of Ilkka's own neighbours, Pentti Posso, to act as the executioner. First, the rebels' arms and legs were shattered with heavy, blunt weapons. Then, one by one, their right hands were hacked off. And finally, their heads were severed. It was a message written in blood and broken bones. Ilkka's corpse, along with the others, was taken to Ilmajoki church. There, they were hoisted onto 3 wooden wheels and displayed in the open air for all to see. The bodies hung there, a grotesque warning to every commoner who might dream of freedom. Later, during a second wave of rebellion, the villagers buried the remains in secret, but after crushing that revolt at Santavori, Klaus Fleming ordered the corpses dug up and exposed again, a final act of humiliation. Even after Ilkka's fall, resistance flared across Finland. In early 1597, new uprisings began, fueled by rumours that Duke Charles himself had ordered the revolt. At Nuijasota, Commander Ivar Tavast failed to break the peasants' defences and turned to treachery. He promised mercy if they surrendered. 400 exhausted clubmen laid down their arms and were slaughtered. Only one man, a priest, was spared. In Ostrobothnia, Hannu Kranka and Pertupalo led a second stronger rebellion. Seasoned and better armed, they rallied thousands. But Governor Fleming moved quickly. His professional army crushed the last of the resistance at the bloody Battle of Sandavori in February 1597. After the Battle of Sandavori, 17 remaining rebel leaders, including Hannu Kranka, Pertupalo, and Martti Tuomala, were taken to Turku Castle. There they were tortured, accused of plotting mass murder for Duke Charles. No confessions came. The rebellion was over. The Club War left deep scars across Finland. Contemporary estimates place the death toll between 1,500 and 11,000. Modern historians believe 2,500 to 3,000 were killed. Nearly all were clubmen. In Ostrobothnia alone, about 10% of the population perished, and in the worst-hit areas of South Ostrobothnia, half the farms were left deserted. Life in the area regressed by 100 years when the houses were left without their masters. Fleming had promised his troops loot in return for their loyalty. After each victory, the rebel regions were thrown open for uncontrolled raiding. Months of terror followed. The Club War ended in defeat, and Finland remained under Klaus Fleming's control until his sudden death in 1597. This opened the way for Duke Charles to invade, leading to a civil war that ended King Sigismund's reign and brought Finland more firmly under Swedish rule. How do modern historians view the Club War? In the 19th century, Finnish nationalists portrayed the Club War as a heroic fight for freedom against foreign oppression. Jaakko Ilkka was turned into a national symbol, and the rebellion was framed as a struggle for Finnish freedom. Later, historians dismissed the Club War as a misguided peasant revolt by an underdeveloped and poorly educated rural population against an emerging Finnish state. According to this interpretation, the peasants were mentally and socially less advanced than their southern counterparts and were easily manipulated by Duke Charles. Some historians point out that the Club War was Finland's last major medieval-style peasant revolt, reflecting a broader European trend of peasants supporting rival rulers to improve their conditions. Today, most scholars agree that the war's roots lie in deep social and economic tensions rather than in nationalist ideals or psychological theories. Historians have pointed to the forced military quartering as the most important single cause of the rebellion. Was it a freedom fight? A class rebellion? A tragic mistake? History doesn't always give us clear answers, but it does leave us stories worth telling. You can't walk far in Ilmajoki without seeing something that recalls Ilkka or the peasant uprising. Several monuments were raised in Ilmajoki to honor Jaakko Ilkka and the Clubmen, including one at the site of the final battle at Santavuori. The town's coat of arms reflects the war, featuring clubs and a crossbow mark, once thought to be Ilkka's, but later identified as belonging to fellow rebel Yrjö Kontsas. Ilkka's legacy lives on also in the name of Ilkka Pohjalainen, one of Finland's biggest newspapers. Ilkka even has a school and playground named after him in Ilmajoki. The Club War ended in defeat. Ilkka was executed, but the events of the rebellion left a lasting mark on Finnish history, shaping how later generations understood justice, power, and resistance.